It's something they should want. They probably won't want it initially, but I think in the end they will. I think in the end they're going to want it. It's very good for them. In fact, it's overly good to them. So we'll see what happens. Now, without them, we don't do the deal, and that's okay. They're not living well. As you know, we cut off aid to Palestinians, and something I don't like to do, but we did that. And we think that there's a very good chance that they're going to want this. I would say their initial, just as great negotiators, and they are great negotiators, their initial response, and I have no idea what they're going to say, would be, oh, we don't want anything. But in the meantime, they'll be negotiating. So let's see how it works.
First, that the deal of the century is the opportunity of the century, and we're not going to pass it by. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. Today, I repeat, I just want to say thank you for everything you've done for the state of Israel. You've been the greatest friend that Israel has had in the White House. And I think tomorrow we can continue making history. Thank you, Mr. President.
I look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. You were just listening to US President Donald Trump speaking to the press in the Oval Office yesterday with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu by his side. Today, that is Tuesday, January 28th, is the day US President Donald Trump will announce what he calls the deal of the century, the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A deal Prime Minister Netanyahu has said will be the opportunity of the century, but for whom exactly is the question that we're also going to be discussing amongst many others in this show today, because the Israelis, if this is an opportunity for them, offering them again a US stamp of approval on illegal occupation of Palestinian land, in which case hasn't that been going on already? President Trump has been unveiling then in that case the deal of the century all along. From his recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital and the consequent relocation of US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, him also recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and let's not forget the recent statements from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo saying that America no longer views Israeli settlements as illegal. Or is this really an opportunity for the Palestinians? And if that's the case, how? So we'll be talking to our guests. Let me introduce who we have with us on the panel today. Mr. Nicolai Due-Gundersen is joining us from London. He's a political analyst and also belongs to the Kingston University, where he teaches, and he's the author of The Privatization of Warfare. Starting with you, Mr. Gundersen, about the situation, of course. First of all, right off the bat, there have been obviously many such peace deals that have been negotiated. Some had come into effect, some barely so in these past, since 1967. But this time around, once again, how is it even a peace plan between two conflicting parties, Israel and Palestine, being even formulated without the Palestinians having any part of it?
Yes, indeed. In fact, I believe that the White House invited Arab leaders to discuss the plan, and so far no one's actually turned up. And the reason for that is because from the Palestinian perspective, this is not really a peace deal. The question, as you mentioned, is whose opportunity is this? I don't feel that there is much trust built between the Trump administration and Palestinians regarding this deal because of Trump's past behavior in the Middle East, which is very pro-Israel. And I think this says a lot. Most Palestinians and Arab leaderships are expecting a skewed deal that will favor Israel rather than be neutral or balanced. I think this is the problem. People like Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority have called Trump a and said that anyone who approaches this deal is a traitor. So I feel that right off the bat, before we get the full coverage of the deal, we see a lot of hostility. Now, to be fair, Trump has even said that the initial reaction will be one of hostility, but he goes further and says, oh, they'll go for it in the long run. I'm not sure if that's the case, and I feel that the reason for that is because Trump is not considering what is the political cost to Arab states and leaderships of accepting such a deal if it feels skewed to not only its leaderships, but also to the people.
Now, you mentioned this, the political cost, which is essentially also missing when Jared Kushner pushed his Peace to Prosperity plan earlier in 2019, something that what critics say is a denunciation of an effective solution, because to not have a political solution going hand in hand with an economic plan is completely futile.
That's very correct, and I think this is part of the problem. Let's remember something. What is Trump's background? Trump is a businessman. This is an individual who has made his name in business, and he is someone who has walked away from deals. He is someone who has focused on financial deals, and I think this is part of the problem, that this is a political event. This is a political conflict, not simply a financial one. So, for example, the blockading of Gaza, which is how some Palestinians feel that Israel has control, it's not just about economic control, it's also about political control. And I think any deal that does not address that will fail. Another thing is, I think that Trump's language can be very patronizing, to only approach things from an economic perspective and to say, oh, you know, they'll go for it. That kind of language also builds on top of previous actions in the Middle East that have not really tried to understand the Arab perspective as well. I think that's also part of it. Even if there are aspects to this deal that are appealing, I think that there's been a lot of damage done when it comes to Trump's actions in the Middle East over the past few years. So, for example, the Golan Heights, the recognition of Jerusalem as part of Israeli territory, which is crossing for Palestinians a red line that previous presidents did not cross. So there's a lot of hostility towards the deal and towards Trump himself in general.
And then when President Trump talks, he expects a wide acceptance of the peace plan. Who exactly is he referring to? Does he have his bets lined up on certain Arab states that he's hoping to get the support of, or has already got a nod of approval from?
Well, that's another aspect. I mean, there's a difference. We have to remember this. There's a difference between the citizens of the Arab world and their leaderships, because often the two do not align. In terms of support, I can imagine some Gulf states may be on board in the long run. Certainly, Saudi Arabia, Oman may be willing to discuss endorsing such a plan because they have softened their stance towards Israel over the past few years. Oman recently hosted Netanyahu at one point, so they may adopt a softer stance, but I think the first thing they're going to watch out for is what is the domestic reaction to this plan, and also how does this plan address annexation. If Israel is able to annex any part of the West Bank, then they're going to be worried that that will be seen as quite hostile, and therefore they may say no.
Now, at the same time, this could also backfire for the overall, what could be said, a compromise with the Oslo Accords having been reached. The Palestinian leadership has already come out and said that if they go ahead with this deal of the century, that they would no longer, like the Prime Minister of Israel, so hopeful to make history here. On the other side, the Palestinians are threatening to quit or from the Oslo Accords over this.
Yes, that's very true. I think also the idea of making history, it's not just Netanyahu who has this hope, but I believe also Trump. And here we have another issue, which is that let's remember Trump's attitude towards other political deals, such as the nuclear deal, which was heavily scaled back. I don't feel Trump necessarily puts two and two together in this case. This is someone who wants to leave a legacy by rolling back the legacy of previous presidents and other accomplishments. And that becomes a problem, because is this a deal that will benefit all, or is this a deal that's coming from a business perspective and also from Trump's egotism?
And he's also mentioned in the Oval Office presser, where he mentions that, you know, we've stopped giving aid to the Palestinians. I don't exactly like this, but, you know, it is what it is. Now, that kind of a almost veiled threat, if one could interpret it that way, it doesn't seem like it's geared, like you mentioned, for a long-term solution, keeping in mind that the political and economic aspect is nowhere in cohesion from what they seem to be suggesting.
Correct. And I think, again, it goes to show the use of economics. And it's not just with Trump, but previous presidents. But I feel that Trump is doing it much less subtly. He's using economics as a way of threatening other countries. We see this, for example, also with Iran and sanctions. We see this now, of course, with the idea of approaching Palestinians and saying, oh, we don't like doing this, but we're going to cut them off. The idea of bullying them into accepting the deal is also part of it. I think that, again, what he's not taking into account is within Palestinian culture and other Arab cultures, there's a lot of focus on saving face. There's a lot of focus on dignity. And I think a lot of Palestinians would say, well, this approach, it hurts our dignity and we will not give that up. If we accept this deal and we don't like it, it basically means that we're allowing Israel to have its way and we are giving up our dignity. So I think there will still be a lot of hostility, and I'm expecting that there will be at some point protests in various Arab capitals, including, for example, in Amman in Jordan, which is next door, and watching what's happening with great interest and possibly concern.
Now, Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, he tweeted that US President Donald Trump's peace plan for the Middle East was delusional. And this tweet came out on Monday. Let me just read out more of what he said. He said, instead of a delusional deal of the century, which will be DOA, self-described champions of democracy would do better to accept Iran's democratic solution proposed by Ayatollah Khamenei. a referendum whereby all Palestinians, Muslims, Jews or Christians decide their future. What do you make of this suggestion? I mean, putting aside US-Iran tensions and the way things are unfolding in Iraq between the two of them, but in a hypothetical situation, in an ideal world, would a referendum like this be the solution to this conflict that's been going on for 45 years?
Well, herein we have an issue, which is, as you just mentioned, this conflict has been going on for almost half a century. I don't think there is an easy solution, but it goes to show no solution can be skewed. Both sides have to be brought to the table, Israelis and Palestinians. And of course, as I'm sure many people are aware, the way that settlements have been built, they have been built in such a way as to over time fragment what we may call Palestinian territory so that we don't have a whole anymore. And this also complicates any solution further. So Iran's tweet or Iran's proposal, I'm not sure which state would be best to actually put forward a resolution or some sort of referendum. But right there, of course, would you be ignoring the Israeli perspective? This is a complicated issue, and especially in Israel right now when we have someone like Netanyahu in power who basically is more right-wing and who probably wants to have a skewed deal anyway. This is going to lead to a lot of tension around this time.
What do you expect, Mr. Nicolai, as the best-case scenario? What are you hoping for would be in the deal that could at least eventually bring the Palestinians on board?
I think that this deal is probably not going to be for everyone, certainly not for the Palestinians. At best, one hope may be if Palestinian authorities and others are willing to talk, to at least use it as a platform to talk, that may be hopeful. And we have to remember, because it is such a complex issue and it's been going on for half a century, we have to go back to almost baby steps. If we can get all parties to sit down in a room and at least talk about how things are going, to face each other and to humanize each other, I think that would be a first good step. So, in other words, it may not mean the acceptance of this deal, but it may mean a slow acceptance of going back to the table and having dialogue again.
Here's what I'm also getting a sense of, that we are talking about baby steps here, at least getting them in the room to start negotiating. The problem really is still not being addressed, because if the president of the United States is the one who's going to step forward, who's in his past years given endorsement after endorsement to illegal settlements, maybe the more impartial authority on this would have been the UNSC, even though the resolutions they passed back in the day, that in 1967, were under the Chapter 6 clause, which essentially made them recommendations and not orders.
Correct. That's another fair point. I think another thing is, when we're going to talk about people sitting down together to negotiate or to have dialogue, who is the appropriate facilitator? Is Trump really the appropriate facilitator, not only for a deal, but for negotiations? Because, again, he has built a reputation in the Middle East of being an aggressive president who is also doing things in Israel's favor. So by definition, how can that be a neutral facilitator?
Good point there. Mr. Nicolai Due-Gundersen, thank you so much for your time and analysis. Here we're going to take a quick short break, and when we're back, we'll be taking a look at the developments in Afghanistan. Welcome back to Newswire. Now, the U.S. military has confirmed that the plane that crashed in Ghazni province on Monday was a U.S. Air Force E-11A battlefield airborne communications node aircraft. However, the claim that it was brought down by enemy fire, that has not yet been confirmed. In fact, a U.S. military spokesperson, Colonel Sonny Liggett, has said that while the cause of the crash is still under investigation, there seems to be no indication that the crash itself was caused by enemy fire. The Taliban, on the other hand, did come out and claim that they have shot down a U.S. aircraft in central Ghazni province, killing the entire crew and several officials. However, details on that claim as to who's taking responsibility for it are still a bit hazy, because Taliban spokesman Zabiullah Mujahid said the jet was destroyed in response to a U.S. raid in the province. There were several tweets that came in. Initially, there were tweets from Zabiullah Mujahid just saying that a U.S. aircraft has come down, killing everybody on board. Now, this couldn't come at a worse time, as U.S.-Afghan Taliban peace talks had not only just restarted, but also both sides had indicated they were close to finalizing a deal after President Trump abruptly called them off last year. Are the peace talks going to be affected by the results of this investigation as to who really is responsible also we will be looking to discuss the volatility of peace in this war-torn country. We'll be touching also briefly on the possibility of, as reports come in, that India might be the country that the Afghanistan government is tapping into to provide troops in Afghanistan for peacekeeping. A lot more coming ahead in this segment. Let me introduce who we will be talking to today. We have on the line Mr. Hamdullah, Hamdard, an analyst joining us from Kabul today. We also have Lieutenant General Ghulam Mustafa speaking to us from Lahore on call, and Mr. Rahimullah Yusufzai, an analyst joining us from Peshawar. Welcome to all three of you here. I want to start with you, Mr. Hamdard, just the beginning to get more details into this crash, on the responsibility, who's behind it. What is your understanding of what is unfolded, as in who is behind? Could this be enemy fire that brought down this US aircraft, or it could have been a technical fault?
Well, I believe that whoever has done this, if Taliban have hit this aircraft, I guess this might adversely affect the peace negotiation process of Taliban with Zalmay Khalilzad in the US delegation. However, it might have been done by Taliban who are backed by Iran, and probably Iran might be looking for taking revenge of Soleimani, who was killed by American forces in Iraq. So there could be lots of doubts. Politically, if Taliban have made this mistake, this will be a big mistake and a huge mistake. It can even stop the negotiation process with the Taliban. However, Taliban have accepted that they have done this, they have hit this because the aircraft was doing a raid on them, and they were kind of doing investigations or things like that. So the situation is still not very clear here in Afghanistan. And even the US have said that they will continue the investigation, and once they have everything in hand, then they will decide about their next move.
The US is being very cautious about the statements also, but when we saw what happened right after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad, we also then heard when the missiles were hit by Iran there, we also then had a very cautious statement coming out that nobody was injured. It's only a few weeks later that details are emerging that there have been many US soldiers who have suffered from brain injuries from that first attack. So coming to you, Jayram Kalam, Mustafa, on your interpretation of what this could essentially mean, let's just shed some light on what would be the incentive for the Taliban to perpetuate a sort of, a spiraling out of control situation, considering they were very close to an agreement with the US?
It's pretty confusing, just hearing this gentleman. But the few things that we need to add here is that while initially Taliban did claim its responsibility, later I believe they also have denied that they have not done it. Regardless, this was an aircraft which is something like over $40 million of aircraft, and it was a surveillance aircraft, and it was not carrying soldiers. And reportedly, it was carrying CIA, operatives of CIA aircraft which came down. Now, who could have done that? It was also reported that it's not an aircraft which is easily traceable on radar, and Taliban have no radar to begin with. So there are a lot of players active at this point in time who are not like Afghanistan to settle. And if that premise is, I think, be taken forward, then there are a number of other players who could be involved. One is, of course, Russia is there, Chinese are there, the Iranian factor we cannot rule out. It's not purely what we call Taliban per se who are active there. There are a lot of other players who are in there. Now, with this news, we add up news of somebody going and requesting the Indians to join in the peacekeeping force. I personally feel that this is not going to land anywhere close to what we think peace in Afghanistan. This whole scenario, to me, appears to be cooked up. So Afghanistan remains on the boil. This is very unfortunate. The Taliban may want now to come to peace, and they may want a peace in that region. But the other players may not like it. So there is something that has to be decided at the top level, where I think Americans, Russians, the Chinese, the main players in the region, they must sit down. And unless they sit down, work out the solution. And Iran has been co-opted. Pakistan, of course, is there. Unless these countries come to an understanding and they clearly backed up by the strength of Chinese and the Russian presence, only then I think we can move forward here. Right now, as I see, things are on the boil. There is no peace in Afghanistan, and Americans, I'm afraid, are not leaving Afghanistan.
Mr. Yusufzai, what's your understanding of what this could essentially mean for US-Taliban peace talks?
I think if it is confirmed that the Taliban have done it, I don't know how, because do they have these kind of missiles, anti-aircraft missiles with which they can hit these aircraft? I don't think they have been able to do it in the past. So that will be something which the Americans, would not accept, and it will make them very angry because this is, a big setback for the U.S. military. But I think the Americans are taking their time. They will, be able to find out as to what happened and who is involved. I think they also know that, Taliban lack this kind of capacity. So let's see, because it could be a technical fault, whatever. The fact that this aircraft crashed in Taliban-controlled area, that is something, which will create some doubt about Taliban. So I think that we have to wait and see as to who is involved. But this is a very bad timing for this kind of incident, because there is hope that there is going to be some trust building. Taliban has agreed to reduce violence, reduce the number of their attacks, and things were going to move ahead as we all felt. Also, a few days ago, the Afghan government claimed that its forces have carried out attacks, in 9 provinces against Taliban, 13 ground offensives and 12 airstrikes. That is also something, which does not augur well for peace, because, the idea was to reduce violence, but here we see that all sides, actually have not been able to reduce violence. In fact, the violence is increasing. So that will be very bad for the peace prospects.
General Ghulam, Mustafa, there are, of course, unconfirmed reports as of yet. There have been just a few media outlets that come out on the local ground reporting this, that the Afghan government might have requested India for a brigade or a division of troops to help keep Taliban good on their promise of curtailing the ISIS and de-escalation in the country. I mean, if one were to only hypothesize over this possibility, that how practical would it be for India to provide that kind of military assistance? What kind of challenges would they be facing?
Much as India would like to have its very strong imprints in Afghanistan, that's what India has been trying. That is what India has been denied over a period of time, the last couple of years. But introducing Indians in the region by way of their forces is not going to bring peace in the region. Frankly, because Pakistan would never ever accept this kind of a presence, Indian troops presence in there. It directly affects Pakistan. Number 2, Taliban themselves, they will not affect like the Indians to come in. And number 3, why would the Afghan government ask the Indian government? Why not the Americans asking the Indians? And if they feel that there's a multinational forces placed there under UN auspices where Indians have a presence there, that is one possibility that one can consider. And that is a possibility only after Pakistan agrees to it and only after the other countries agree to it. Because like I pointed out earlier, there are other players in the region and they're very strong players. It's not so simple as to feel that the Americans can strike a deal and get out of it. No. And number 2, as I pointed out earlier, this aircraft, I think, was carrying the CIA operatives.
Well, there's only one report coming out of Iran from a unit called Front Page that claims that. So we can't really be sure yet that if it's true that the CIA head of operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, was on board Michael Andrea.
Actually, this is what is surprising. The Pentagon is taking time in coming out with the truth like it did in way back about 10 days back, like you pointed out earlier. I think Pentagon knows. I think Americans know what happened to the aircraft. And I think they know exactly who did it. And I think that's what scares the Americans also, because if you recall way back in the 80s, when Taliban were equipped with the Stinger missiles and they went after the Soviet aircraft, Soviet Air Force and Soviet helicopter forces, that is when the things started tilting in their favor. Now, this is something that is something very new in this region. If Afghan Taliban or any other element is supported in this manner, which provides them the anti-aircraft capability, that would be a deadly blow to the American interest, and that is what the Afghan government will also be scared. Now, on one hand, like Rahimullah Yusufzai pointed out, they talk about peace. On the other, the Afghan government itself is up the ante. So I think the overall game plan in Afghanistan is not working out. And like the peace that we that the peace that we like to have in Afghanistan, much that we like to have Afghanistan settled. It is unfortunate that the region around is not stable. Iran, number one, why would the Americans create problem with Iran to the extent that Iran is a player in Afghanistan, and unless Iran agrees to it, there will be no peace in Afghanistan.
Right.
And if you like it or not, it may not be so assumed, but the Russians have an interest in this region. Unless the Russians satisfied, there will be no peace in this region.
Okay.
And frankly, it's a pretty confusing situation right now.
It is a very confusing situation. Something you pointed out also here, the Americans are very cautious. The Pentagon has been very sort of muted on who was in the aircraft, especially since Taliban has been coming out with claims, conflicting claims, that they brought it down with enemy fire or not. Coming back to you, Mr. Yusufzai, could there be a possibility that there is a spillover here happening in Afghanistan? We have seen that in Iraq, especially the past month, has been the battleground of US-Iran tensions. Could it possibly be a spillover in Afghanistan also happening as a result?
Yes, I think first I want to clarify that Stinger missiles and blowpipe missiles made by the US and the UK are a thing of the past. They were available with the Afghan Mujahideen, never available with Taliban. And the helicopter which was brought down in Kunar province in 2007, as you mentioned, was brought down by an RPG-7 rocket. And this became a big story in the US media because the helicopter had come so low down in that valley that, Taliban fighters were able to hit it and kill a number of American soldiers. So I think that's why I was saying I was, a bit skeptical of if Taliban have that capacity. But as you are now saying, the spillover effect. Now, if the Iranians, want to take revenge, they have already done this in Iraq, they can manage something in Afghanistan as well, especially in western Afghanistan, but they won't do it in Herat or Farah or Nimroz, which are on their border, because then Iran will be directly blamed. So maybe they're trying to do things in other provinces which are a bit away from the Iranian border. And if they are giving, missiles to Taliban, we don't know. I don't think that the Russians or Chinese or anybody else would be giving these kind of weapons to Taliban. The only, suspect could be Iran. But we still don't know. We do not want to jump to conclusions.
Right.
But this is a very, dangerous development. If the Americans are able to find out that this was brought down by a missile, then who gave the missile to Taliban? Which country? Which, from which place they got it? That will be something which will really damage the peace process. But I think that the Americans would not jump to conclusions. They will take their time. Maybe they already know who has done this, but they're waiting for some confirmation. And they also have to intimate the families of the people who got killed. That cannot remain a secret for long.
Right. So moving discussion, as we do not have complete details of who was behind this aircraft going down, whether it was a technical problem, it was shot down by enemy fire. But let's also talk about how, besides the peace talks being affected, and I want to come to you here, Mr. Hamdard, the possibility that peacekeeping forces are being sort of addressed right now. I mean, I'm referring to an incident last month where Afghanistan's National Security Advisor went to New Delhi, Hamdullah, report saying that he requested troop presence there or for a peacekeeping force. I mean, we talked a little about the challenges that would be logistically for India, but in terms of how this would affect the peace process itself, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, as you might know, technically, whenever we are talking about the withdrawal of the international troops, especially the NATO forces and the American forces from Afghanistan, to make sure that this process is going on and implemented very smoothly and without civil war once again in Afghanistan, we have to have some peacekeeping forces in Afghanistan. I guess this is a good plan, but talking to who about it, this might have some regional problems. You know that if we are talking to India, probably Pakistan will complain that then their forces should also be here to keep the peace, or they should be the peacekeeping forces here. And Iran might also say the same thing. China might also say the same thing, because China, Russia, Pakistan, Iran, and these neighboring countries, in the regional countries, they all have special interest in Afghanistan. Why they have interest, the reasons are very obvious. That Afghanistan is a very rich country according to its natural resources, and beside its geopolitical location is also worth of having focus on it and having interest in it. So I guess if we request, I mean, if Afghanistan is requesting India to give some peacekeeping forces to Afghanistan to work here and to maintain the peace, to keep the peace, then probably Pakistan will have a reaction on this. And whenever Afghanistan is going to ask India for such forces, they should consider the regional politics as well. And they should also, I guess, talk to Pakistan to convince them that the Indian forces in Afghanistan will not be used here in Afghanistan against Pakistani workers in Afghanistan, or against Pakistani companies in Afghanistan, because Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, these are neighboring countries, and they should all maintain and try to cement the friendly ties forever. So there would be some tensions for Pakistan probably.
And that could be the sort of a deal breaker in a situation already at the edge of a decision here, as the Afghan Taliban and the US are trying to finalize a deal and violence continues. Mr. Yusufzai, how do you see it? Is this even worth India's time to take the kind of financial cost to provide a peacekeeping force in Afghanistan?
You know, if you remember, President Trump also asked India to provide forces in Afghanistan. He also wanted Indians to play a bigger role in the development and reconstruction sector in Afghanistan. So the Indians until now have resisted, have denied, and have refused to do this. And I think in future also I don't expect the Indians to send their troops to Afghanistan. They know that, any foreign troops, when they land in Afghanistan, they become the target eventually.
Right.
I don't think there's any real proposal yet to have, a peacekeeping force in Afghanistan. That could be part of the peace process. If it moves ahead, peacekeeping forces, then that is, has been mentioned but never really discussed seriously. And even if they want to send a peacekeeping force, it will be under the banner of the UN, I believe. OIC does not fit the bill. I don't think OIC can even provide any peacekeeping forces. So this will be, I think, something which will happen in future, but I don't think that the Indians would become part of even any UN peacekeeping force, because that will not be acceptable to Taliban, number one. That will not be acceptable to Pakistan. Maybe China also will oppose it. So you create a new problem, if you send Indian troops or even Pakistani troops I think that will, create problems between the neighbors.
Okay.
And the idea to stabilize Afghanistan would not happen.
Right. It would be counterproductive, you're saying. It would be counterproductive. We just got the last 30 seconds here. General Mustafa, if I could get your closing comments here as an overall sort of introspection into how is this going to move forward? I mean, the violence in Afghanistan, if anything, as we've all talked about this just now, has increased, if not decreased at all or been stable. And the peace talks again seem to be at the precipice of failing. How do you think this is going to move forward, develop into another failure of the peace talks like last year?
I think we are headed towards that direction, much that one feels bad about it, but that is how the situation on ground looks like. With the Americans, I think they're not giving very clear signals. They're not, I'm sure they're clear in what they want to do, but how to go about doing it is where the problem lies. And Taliban by themselves, they must, as I said earlier, they also want to have peace in Afghanistan, but the kind of peace that Taliban want is not suitable to the interest of the Americans or the others that play in the region, particularly Iran. Iran, I've always been pointing out, is a major player for in Afghanistan, and they have to be on board. And Americans picking up this kind of trouble by shooting down Qasem Soleimani and his other colleagues, that actually has created destabilizing impact on Afghanistan also.
Absolutely.
Okay. The Americans seem to be pretty confused in what they're doing, because not realizing that if you pick up a serious problem with Iran at this point in time, when the peace talks are likely to succeed, that actually meant that the Americans don't want peace in this region.
They don't want peace in the region. Lieutenant General Ghulam Mustafa there, thank you so much for joining us, and Mr. Hamdullah Hamdard, as well as Mr. Rahimullah Yusufzai, for giving us your analysis. We've unfortunately run out of time. We will see you tomorrow with more news and analysis coming your way. Till then, goodbye.